Southeast Asia is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Every year, the region faces more extreme weather events that affect millions of people. It is also one of the world's most dynamic regions, and as the populations and economies grow, so does the demand for green, resilient and sustainable infrastructure. But governments cannot finance all the necessary projects on their own. Support from more sources, both public and private, is necessary to accelerate this green transition.
As we recognise in ADB, the battle for climate change will be won or lost in the Asia Pacific. And in that battle, the decisive front is Southeast Asia. ASEAN countries alone need well over $200 billion of infrastructure investment every year to keep up with the rapid urbanisation and industrialisation of the region. And all of that investment across every sector must mitigate or adapt to climate change if we are to have any chance in this battle. Bringing these projects to life requires innovative thinking, more sources of catalytic financing and strong partnerships. And this is where the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility is helping to show the way.
The ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, or the ACGF, was founded in 2019 by the Asian Development Bank and ASEAN governments linked to the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. At the ACGF, we support the development of landmark green infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia by using innovative financing to catalyse funds from public and private sources. We also mobilise expertise to help create sustainable and bankable infrastructure projects.
The ACGF supports government-led projects which are green, bankable, and able to mobilize capital from all sources, including private capital. We also offer capacity development for government officials, as well as technical support for developing early project concepts so that they can qualify for funding. This combination of concepts, technical assistance, knowledge, and financing from ADB and partners makes ACGF a one-stop shop for catalyzing green infrastructure projects in the ASEAN region.
In Indonesia, Cambodia, and the Philippines, for example, we are supporting climate-related policy reforms and transformative green infrastructure projects in energy, transport, agriculture, and natural resources. In Cambodia, we are helping to restore mangroves and enabling small and medium-sized businesses in the fisheries sector to adopt sustainable practices. And in Thailand, we are supporting a number of ministries in issuing sustainability-linked bonds to help fund the green transition.
Our region is blessed with natural beauty, but faces with the urgent environmental issue, including climate change, deforestation, and air pollution. Green finance and infrastructure are vital, protecting our environment and boosting our economy, with benefits like job creation, innovation, and investment in sustainable projects, ensuring long-term stability and prosperity. Green finance is not merely an option, it is an imperative. The ACGS play a key role in this transformation, speeding up the transition toward the sustainability.
Since 2019, we have brought together financing, knowledge, and skills from some of the world's leading development organizations.
Infrastructure and finance are at the heart of the region's economic recovery, and these feature in most of the stimulus packages in the region. Making these green and resilient strengthens both climate and socioeconomic resilience of affected communities in the region. I believe that the ACGF will pave the way for a green recovery in Southeast Asia by integrating international standards for climate impact and by developing and investing in resilient and low-carbon projects.
By now, we have become ASEAN's most prominent platform in mobilizing ideas, capital, and partnerships to drive green infrastructure. To learn more about the ACGF, our projects and initiatives, and how we can help, go to adb.org/ACGF or scan this QR code.
everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Good afternoon from ADB headquarters here in Manila. I'm Esmira Javier. I'm a climate change specialist for climate finance. And welcome to the first of many interesting series here, which we are starting off with the climate finance landscape of Southeast Asia, gaps, challenges, and opportunities. Um, for today's webinar, we will actually examine obstacles of the uneven mitigation and adaptation financing and implications in the region. It would also identify opportunities to narrow the gap and look at the roles of both the public and private sectors in accelerating the delivery of climate change solutions, especially for the region. I want to thank everyone who has joined us online as well as in advance to our esteemed speakers, which is quite strikingly strike a gender balance in our panel. This is, by the way, hosted by the Southeast Asia Regional Department's Green Finance Hub, the Asian Catalytic Green Finance Facility, and of course, the Southeast Asia Development Solutions Group. So good day, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. And I think we should get the ball rolling. So just to go through the concept of the program is that we're going to have two presenters from two esteemed institutions based the Climate Policy Initiative as well as from OECD Environment Directorate. There will be two presentations of around 10 minutes each, and our colleagues from Asian Development Bank, led by Tristan Knowles, as well as Naida Krishna Morgado, will come in also with interventions on specific reactions from the presentations, as well as to discuss some of ADB's initiatives on accelerating climate change solutions and climate finance in the region. But let me first introduce our first speaker and presenter, Ms. Fiana Larasati, or we call her Chica, is actually a manager at the Climate Policy Initiative and is the lead of CPI's Indonesia's workstream on energy transition and sustainable finance. She has more than 11 years of professional experience in sustainable investment, risk management, banking and capital markets, and due diligence. She will be delivering a presentation on addressing the challenges in mobilizing effective climate finance. Over to you, Chica.
Thank you, Esmira, and good day, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So without further ado, Esmira, if I may just share my screen and presentations. All right. Is my screen okay, Esmira? All right, thank you so much. So without further ado, brief introduction has been done by Esmira. I'm Chica from CPI Indonesia, and we would like to share to you on the climate finance landscape on the Asia and the Pacific, and we're going to zoom into the Southeast Asia as our focus of our discussion today. And here is the first one. This, if you see here, there's a spaghetti chart. So we call it Sankey chart. So this is actually depict how the climate finance flow in Asia and Pacific for the past years. We try to zoom in where the sources are. And then as Mara previously mentioned, there are also a combination of public and private finance and goes into which sectors and which instruments are currently provided to these sectors. And as Mara also mentioned earlier in the introduction, there's also we're not saying misallocation, but there's an unbalanced allocation between the mitigation and adaptation, which can also we can discuss more based on the data that we the data that we are currently assessing in annual basis. CPI produce a global climate landscape in annual basis to assess the alignment of this finance supply and what are the climate finance need to achieve the NDC's target. And here we can see here the mitigation. the uses, the mitigation dominates. And also here, from the sources as well, we can see the blue ones is actually the public sectors, and the orange colors is the private sectors. We see they kind of play certain roles in order to fill up the climate finance gap. And then here, if we zoom in, how much that we track. So the climate finance tracking that currently that CPI is doing an annual basis, and also on Asia Pacific, we did it with ADB. Thank you so much, ADB, for the support. We tracked the finance supply, and we found out that only 5% of the climate finance in the Asia Pacific went into Southeast Asia, and a lot of this supply is actually goes into the East Asia. And then if we compare it to the climate finance need, we try to track how much is the climate finance need based on the NDC commitment, and it's actually up to 1.7 trillion annual finance flow will need to be invested in Asia and Pacific in order to achieve their NDC's target. So this here is actually we try to do the assumptions based on 38 developing countries NDC's commitment. And if we go to the global context, it's actually at least 4.3 trillion of the global annual finance flow, or 20% year-on-year increase by 2030 is actually required to avoid the worst impacts of the climate change. So despite of this, actually quite, we see that it's quite a big gap, but it represents less than 5% of the global GDP. And we also see here in the Asia Pacific, and if we zoom into Southeast Asia as well, we see that public finance dominates, and private finance also needs to scale up, because as we see earlier, we have a quite big amount of climate finance gap. And now, what are the funding source, and also what are the sectors that these finance are currently targeted based on our tracking? And we see here the financial instruments mainly mostly in the form of the debt instruments. It is actually aligned with the growing volume and variety of this kind of instruments, such as the green bonds, and then the green sukuk, green credit facilities, and also the blended finance. And this is actually in the market rate debt. So yeah, this is the data. This is what the data shows. And when we receive the equity instruments, it flowed almost exclusively to the energy investments, such as the renewable energy generations, and some also, we also track quite amount of the investment, although it's still small, to the transmissions and distributions, and also the energy efficiency. And while grants here were channeled for the cross-sectoral investments, and also to support the policy making that can enable these investments to scale up. So here are the financial instruments. And when we see further, what are the sectors are currently financed? So we see here, it focuses on the mitigations. We see more than 80% of the finance flow in Southeast Asia go into the mitigation sectors, such as the renewable energy. Some also goes into the EVs, and also land use change, and also other those kind of the more mature sectors. And also for the adaptations, we see here it flows only 12%, and mainly sourced from the international finance. So the adaptation finance mostly went into the priority sectors, such as the land use and natural management, and water and wastewater management. And also, we see some of the portion of the adaptation finance goes into the institutional strengthening, capacity building, and other actions intended to facilitate policymaking for the adaptation finance to scale up. And the rest of the finance goes into dual benefits, meaning that this is the combinations of adaptation and mitigations finance. And based on our data of the Asia Pacific climate finance landscape that we did previously with ADB, and also the annual global climate finance landscape by CPI, we see the key challenges in mobilizing effective climate finance mostly is in the adaptation finance and the data gap. So we see here there's kind of insufficient effort is being made to address the climate adaptations, because based on the data and also some of the survey, the focus group survey that we did last year, I think we did the focus group survey for the past 3 years for CPI to update the global climate finance landscape, and we see that there's a higher perceived risk of the adaptation project because most of the adaptation project requiring higher capital upfront, and also there's a longer term. So in order for the financiers to provide their capital, they need to be in a longer term for the project to be really complete, and also some of the project also need longer term and longer period to reach into the financial close. And then some of the data and also the project are usually fragmented and also small in scale, incremental, and sector specific, and all the potential deterrents to financing to particularly by private sector is basically the economic of scale and also the sector specific. And this finding is also confirmed in the IPCC report 2 years ago. And then on the terms of the data gaps and limitations in tracking and reporting climate finance, also key challenges in mobilizing climate finance, effective climate finance, because $1 of the climate finance, you want to know how much is the impact to the mitigation, for example, or maybe for the adaptation sectors. And when it comes to the adaptation finance data, the data are mostly fragmented because of lack of precise and comprehensive national to local finance-related data for individual countries. So we need to do a deep dive each countries. And also there's also a constraint defining the adaptation relevant activities and universally accepted impact metrics for adaptation finance. And lastly is publicly available data on private climate finance is also one of the key challenges, because on the adaptations finance for the private sector, they're still reporting it in voluntary basis. Some also mentioning that there's a confidentiality reason, so that's why they cannot disclose the granular data of the adaptations data. So this is the key data gap of adaptation finance. And other than that, for the Southeast Asia and also the Asia as a whole, we see that the access to finance would be one of the key challenges as well. The region, and also based on our report on the global climate finance landscape, the global also shows the similar outlook that these regions still rely on the fossil fuel, making the low carbon transition is a challenge. Because as we see on the previous slide before, although more than 80% mitigation finance goes to renewables, but it's still outpaced by the fossil fuel subsidies. And also, as a developing countries, some of the countries have a limited access to long-term finance, especially for small-scale climate projects. And there's also constraint in capacity to attract sufficient investment to the sectors, region, or country where it is needed the most. In this case, the adaptation would be one of the sector that need the climate finance the most, as this is still underallocated based on our data. And also there's a gap in institutional capacity and arrangement to access to climate finance. I think here the role of the MDBs is really pivotal to really accelerate and how to bridge the capacity gap, making the project is ready to finance, making it more bankable, and also provide the capacity building for these institutions maybe or the organizations for them to access the climate finance that's already in the market. And here also role of international finance is also the key. And maybe later my colleague Kiara can elaborate more on the role of the MDB and international finance. And here, based on our data and our assessment, addressing the challenges of mobilizing climate finance in Asia would be clustered in 3 clusters. The first one is from public, blended, and private. On the public finance, we know that there's a scarce public funding is being directed at subsidizing fossil fuel industries in many emerging economies, especially in Southeast Asia. So I think because of this limited amount of this public funding, we can try to shift this and add the green conditionalities to any subsidies. So making it more impactful to every dollar that flows into which sector or which project that is really needed by the countries to adapt to the climate change. And then the climate solution project also suffer from the regulation uncertainty. There's a cost overruns, there's delays, some of the adaptation project, which require also longer transactions close. And also there's a permit risk limit and the supply of high quality climate solutions projects. So this is related to the bankability of the climate projects. And then in the middle, there's a blended finance where the role of NBD and maybe all the catalytic capital can play a role. Here is risk is generally higher in emerging markets. So this is where the blended finance can play a role as providing the risk mitigation tools and deployed at a scale so that it can trigger the private sector, the private finance to contribute more because there's more better risk allocation between the public and the private sectors. And lastly, on the private finance, we see that most of the corporates and also the FIs has the net zero commitment, but some of the commitment has not translated into internalized policy. This is based on our studies as well. I think 2 years ago on we tried to do the focus group survey to the banking institutions, domestic banking institutions in Indonesia. And this is what we found. And we see that the ESG disclosure and climate risk assessment will need to be emphasized more so that the private sectors can also get the sense that changing or maybe shifting some of their portfolio to the lower carbon technologies is actually a necessity for them to avoid the risk of the stranded assets. So I think that's all, Asmara. The climate finance landscape of Asia and focusing on Southeast Asia that I can share based on our study that we conduct together last year and also based on the latest CPI global climate finance landscape this year. Over to you, Asmara. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Chika. And it was a pleasure working with the Climate Policy Initiative. It was quite a journey, but we were able to finalize that report that we reported. One of the most downloaded publications actually for ADB for us. So maybe we have another opportunity to work together in the future. So before we go on to the next presenter, I just wanted to ask if anyone has a burning question or a clarificatory question. I can give you a minute or okay, so we do have one. There's a question for Chika. How increasing geopolitical tension just right now, like the Iran-Israel, would affect the cost of financing for Southeast Asia? Quite a charged first question here we have.
Yeah, I think we need to, aside from internalizing climate risks, right? We also need to internalize the cost of the geopolitical, because it definitely will affect the impact to the transaction cost and also the FX, the FX cost also would be impacted by this kind of thing, because most of the public finance aid that comes into the developing country will be in terms of the non-local currency. So I think, of course, this will affect the cost of finance. First, the FX cost, and also the geopolitical cost, which is, the transition cost on transition risk of the climate change, and also this, macro and macroeconomic level of these costs.
No, thank you. And I think one of the, I know I'm the moderator, but I just wanted to add something as well. I think if there are some geopolitical scenes or conflict, some of the priorities get shifted in addressing those urgent situations, right? Like what happened in COVID-19 process. the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So all of these elements actually shift some of the focus of the countries in terms of addressing climate change, I think is another impact of such situations. Now, I know we have a lot of questions, and I also have a lot of questions for Chica, but also and also just to add, there's additional points on the chat as well from our colleagues, is that, you know, we will have time to ask further questions on this, but let me turn this over to our next presenter, so which is Ms. Chiara Falduto. I hope you're online. Chiara is actually a policy analyst in the Finance for Climate Action team of the OECD Environment Directorate. Chiara leads the analysis of the OECD flagship series reports on climate finance and the $100 billion goal. And Chiara will talk about what that $100 billion goal is, which actually focuses on climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries towards the goal of mobilizing 100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries. Her particular presentation today is focused on climate finance in provided and mobilized for developing countries, some of the lessons from the 100 billion goal exercise and the opportunities ahead. So over to you, Chiara.
Thank you very much, Ismaira, and hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you so much to the ADB for inviting me and also organizing this excellent event. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Is everything fine? Do you see my screen and hear my voice?
Yes, all good.
Perfect. Great. So indeed, as Ismaira just mentioned, I'm going to share with you a couple of insights from OECD work on climate finance. So we've just heard from Chica, an excellent presentation that provides an overview of the broader financial landscape. If you wish, this presentation focuses on a rather smaller share of this broader financial landscape, which is climate finance. And by climate finance, we usually intend finance that is being provided or mobilized by developed countries for developing countries specifically. So I'm going to focus on this subset. Whenever we talk about climate finance, I think that one of the first things that comes to mind is the 100 billion goal. So for those of you who are not familiar with this goal, it's a goal that was undertaken in the context of the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where developed countries committed to jointly mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries. The goal was later reiterated at COP21 in 2015 and extended to 2025. Now, the OECD has been tracking progress towards this goal since 2015, and I'm going to share a few insights from our work in just a second. And in our work in the context of climate finance, we identify 4 different components of climate finance. So one are bilateral public flows, meaning flows from developed country governments to developing countries. A second component is multilateral public finance, meaning outflows from multilateral institutions such as MDBs to developing countries. Thirdly, export credits. And finally, private climate finance mobilized by public finance interventions, which is what Chica was referring to in her presentation as blended finance. Now, a very important point that I wanted to mention here is that for multilateral public finance, in the OECD, we have developed a methodology that only captures those outflows that can be attributed back to developed countries, because we do recognize that there are many developing countries who are also shareholders of several MDBs and therefore contribute financially to the operations of these MDBs. But in the context of tracking progress towards the 100 billion goal, which is a goal for developed countries, we do take these out. And I'm happy to respond to any questions that you have on this later on. So we released our latest report last year, which covers data up to 2021. And we found that in 2021, developed countries jointly provided or mobilized 89.6 billion for climate action in developing countries. This means that as of 2021, the 100 billion goal was still unmet, because as a reminder, the goal said that by 2020, developed countries should have mobilized $100 billion. As you can see from the graphs that you have in front of your eyes, the increase over the years in finance provided was mainly driven by the public component, so bilateral public and multilateral public. On the other hand, especially, it's quite striking that the mobilization of private finance remained relatively low and stagnated around 14 billion throughout since 2017. And this is particularly striking as public finance has, on the other hand, substantially increased. In our analysis, we also do conduct some disaggregated analysis to show more granular trends. And here we find something very similar to what Chika presented in her presentation. So in terms of climate theme, we see that the vast majority of climate finance targets mitigation. We have seen an increase of adaptation finance over the years with a slight drop in 2021, but still 67% between 2016 and 2021 was for mitigation. In terms of public finance instruments, again, we see an overwhelming majority of finance being provided via loans, just 25% via grants, and the remaining share is equity. We do see, however, a higher share of grants in low-income countries and LDCs, and also a higher share of grants in adaptation finance compared to mitigation finance. But overall, in any of these country groupings and climate themes, in any case, loans remain the majority. Finally, in terms of recipient income groups, we see that the majority of finance is targeting middle-income countries, so either lower middle-income countries or upper middle-income countries. This is partially because these countries are very numerous compared to other income groups. However, even if we were to look at per capita income or per capita finance received, we would still see higher figures for middle-income countries than other countries. We heard a lot from Chika the importance of private finance in financing climate action in developing countries. And so I just wanted to share this slide that focuses on the mobilization of private climate finance. And we see that mobilization is happening overwhelmingly in the energy sector, as you see from the first graph that you have there. We see very, very small amounts for being mobilized for adaptation, just 9% of total private finance mobilized. And here we see actually that strikingly 40% of private finance was mobilized in upper middle income countries. So it's a slightly different trend compared to what I just showed you before, seeing that a lot of mobilization happens, yes, in this particular share of countries. Given the context of this webinar, I also wanted to spend a couple of words on the role of MDBs specifically. You may remember from the very first graph that I showed you on progress towards the 100 billion goal that multilateral public finance played a very important role in driving progress towards the goal, and specifically MDBs. We see that the MDBs together account for 88% of total multilateral public finance provided, the remaining share being provided by climate funds. And also MDBs are behind 60% of total climate finance that is mobilized from the private sector. We do see that MDBs compared to, for example, bilateral provider, provide a higher share of finance in the form of loans compared to bilateral providers. And finally, we see also that MDBs are more active in countries that have relatively higher risk profiles. And so they help mobilize more private finance in these type of countries. So they take on more risks compared to bilateral providers. In our work at OECD, beyond just tracking progress towards the 100 billion goal, lately we try to look into opportunities for overcoming some of the bottlenecks and barriers that we see in climate finance trends. And from what I showed you so far, I think there are two key barriers or bottlenecks in a way that come to mind. One is indeed the mobilization of private finance, which has not happened at the potential that was hoped initially. But also there is a bottleneck in terms of the provision and mobilization of finance for adaptation specifically, which continues to remain quite low. So last year we released 2 in-depth analyses that you have here on the left of the slide that try to look into these issues and again outline some recommendations. I'm not going to go into the details of this, happy to respond to any questions, but very broadly we saw 3 key recommendations that are cross-cutting between these two areas, and they are here listed on the slide. So first, we see in general a need to rethink how climate finance is deployed, meaning focusing a bit more on instruments that are really targeting mobilization of finance. So for example, scaling up the use of guarantees or insurance to make sure that private investors do see a potential for investing in climate, but also scaling up new instruments such as, for example, green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, SDRs, so special drawing rights by the IMF, debt for climate swaps. There are so many new instruments that are emerging that really hold the potential to significantly scale up the availability of finance in developing countries. A second key area of action relates to the MDB operational structures and mandates. We see that there is a bit of untapped potential from the MDBs in mobilizing even more private finance. In our study, we saw that very few MDBs have specific mobilization strategies or targets. And so this is something definitely an area for increased opportunities, but also increasing lending in local currencies to lower the cost of capital and in general improve data disclosure and transparency. We heard from Chica that there are some issues in terms of accessing this information to make sure that that we know what is happening and where we need to course correct. Finally, third area of action is strengthening capacity in developing countries, because we do see a bit of also an issue in terms of the demand for adaptation finance. So of course, there is in general need for climate finance in developing countries, but sometimes there aren't enough project proposals, project pipelines readily available that can attract investments. And so a lot of work can be, there are many opportunities for strengthening technical capacity in these countries to help them develop these project pipelines, plans, long-term plans, to make sure that there is a trajectory in terms of where finance is most needed over the years, over the next decades. Yeah, so again, these are just 3 key takeaways that I wanted to share with you, but happy to go into the details later in the discussion. And I'm going to finish with just a few thoughts with this last slide, and a few thoughts on what is happening in the climate negotiation space currently and over the next few months. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the 100 billion goal was extended to 2025, meaning that next year it will come to an end. And in this context, in the context of UNFCCC negotiations, parties are currently negotiating a new goal, NCQG, so new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which will replace the 100 billion goal as of 2026. So negotiations are still ongoing, and there isn't yet a clear convergence on what this NCQG will precisely look like, but it's probable that the NCQG will be a bit wider in scope compared to the 100 billion goal, to make sure that it's up to the current financing challenges. We saw from Chica that developing countries will need trillions in the next few years in terms of climate finance. At UCD, we have done some work on the NCQG and we have outlined a few recommendations on what we think this goal could look like, or what are the opportunities for this goal. And here I have just listed 3. So first, we see a strong need for the NCQG to clearly outline roles and responsibility of various public actors, so not just developed countries. Notwithstanding the leading role that developed countries will continue to have, it would be very important for the NCQG to define a little bit more or highlight a bit more the increasing role of non-traditional providers, but also be a bit more specific of what is the role of MDBs and multilateral providers, given their very strong role in the current 100 billion goal. A second recommendation is to recognize the critical role of the private sector. So we will not be able to face the climate challenge without bringing in the private sector. So the goal could speak and provide some signals to the private sector more specifically. And finally, a third point is to go perhaps a little bit beyond monetary benchmarks. So not only targeting a certain amount of finance that needs to be provided or mobilized, but try to go a bit beyond that, addressing issues of quality of finance, access of finance, but also all those policy frameworks and environments that will need to be put in place in order to make sure that finance can be used more effectively, but also that private sector can be brought in more systematically and efficiently. So I'll stop here and happy to go over to respond to any questions that you may have.
No, thank you very much, Chiara, for that very succinct presentation. I like my presenters quite a bit because they're keeping to their time. But before I open up again for a question or two to the audience or participants, I do have one quick question for you. One of the critical differences between the 100 billion exercise by 2020 and this NCQG, or the new collective quantified goal, is that NCQG comes with a very comprehensive process. In fact, a 3-year working program from 2022 to 2024. And I think that's a stark contrast between how the 100 billion 2020 goal was determined, which was basically, you know, a 1-week discussion between developed countries and developing countries. So in that context, I mean, we did not reach the 100 billion in 2020. I think, could you give us 1 or 2 reasons why could that be, other than the fact, you know, it didn't really go through a process, it wasn't too comprehensive, there was no clear outline, but were there any other factors that have affected that that failure or that lateness to achieve the 100 billion in 2020?
This is a very good question, and I mean, that's something that we try to look into. I think one of the main I wouldn't say missed opportunities, but one of the key factors that perhaps was not expected was that mobilization would remain so low. So the OECD had also produced some forward-looking estimates back in 2017, I believe, where we tried to project how climate finance would evolve by 2020. And we did project a much higher share of mobilization, which remained very low. I showed from the graph, it never went beyond 14 billion. So this is definitely something where I think also providers are very much looking into, so trying to understand how to increase the mobilization potential. And I think right now also there is a bit of a better understanding that the private sector that will play a major role. The UNFCCC negotiations and in general the climate debate right now has expanded a lot also to the private sector. I think there is a little bit more of understanding from the private sector itself that there are opportunities for investing here. So I'm really hopeful that in the next few years we will see a slight increase in that sense, and hopefully the NCQG, as I mentioned, will really be an opportunity to also understand what are the signals that are specifically needed for the private sector, and the NCQG will be able to integrate these signals in its structure.
No, thank you. So we do have one question for you, Chiara, from the audience. Do you think that the donors' growing prioritization of blending and leveraging private resources keeps investment in adaptation lower?
So it's again a very good question. I don't think one excludes the other in a way, because if you wish, I mean, the whole goal of focusing a bit more on blended finance is to understanding how the least amount of public finance can mobilize the most amount of private finance. So I think there it's a bit of a question on understanding what exactly can be done to achieve this maximization of potential of public finance. And once that is reached, then it will unlock a big share of public finance that can be spent on those activities that have very little potential for private investments, and that will continue to need to be continued supported by public finance. So hopefully, actually, the other way around will be true, that at some point donors will be able to invest more of their public finance into adaptation, but also climate action more generally for low-income countries, LDCs, and SIDS. So yes, I think this is something that many providers are looking into. Many of them have come up with some strategies for both mobilization and how to increase adaptation finance, because I just want to remind the audience that there is also another goal in the context of the UNFCCC, which is the doubling of adaptation finance goal. Through which providers have committed to doubling the amount of adaptation finance provided compared to 2019 levels by 2025. And so many donors do have some strategies now in place that hopefully will help them meet this goal next year.
Thank you. But I think before we shift to my colleagues, Tristan and Naida, I think there's a critical question here, and I think it's important that we actually clarify the difference between the 100 billion target as well as the trillions of climate financing that are actually needed. And perhaps you can link it up a little with how the discussions with the NCQG is that, the target should meet priorities and needs of countries as well. I don't know if you see this question about UNFC's, well, it's 100 billion needed by 2025. How does it reconcile? I think the 1.3 trillion only refers to the climate financing for infrastructure in Asia and the Pacific. But how, because there's a lot of numbers going out there, coming out, 10 billion, 100 billion, 3 trillion. So maybe you could just explain a little the differences and how it connects to the exercise on NCQG as well. Thanks, Chiara.
Indeed, another excellent question. So I did mention at the very beginning of the presentation that climate finance is, if you wish, a bit of a subset of the broader financial landscape that Chika presented. And indeed, if you just compare the figures, so we are talking about less than 100 billion, whereas in the figures that Chika presented on how much finance is being mobilized for climate at the global level, it's much higher volumes. Having said that, I think with the 100 billion goal specifically, when it was established, it was never with the idea of completely fulfilling developing countries' needs, but rather to start and create momentum for providers, MDBs, private sector, to start mobilizing the finance that will be needed. So, and in this way, I think the 100 billion goal, the 100 billion goal has succeeded in the sense that now how to finance, how to support climate action in developing countries and how to mobilize the scale of finance required is a bit of a more prominent topic in the context of the negotiations, but also more broadly. Having said that, now there is also a much clearer understanding compared to 20 years ago, almost, when the 100 billion goal was initially being negotiated. There is a much stronger understanding of what exactly are the needs in developing countries. And so I think that's where the NCQG comes in. So by trying to move beyond the role of just developed countries in providing public finance and helping mobilize, but also trying to bring in more systematically the private sector, because it's clear that to move from billions to trillions, public finance alone will never suffice. And there will be a strong need to bring in the private sector, especially in those sectors where really investments are potentially a very good opportunity, because they can generate also some profits. And so yes, I think the NCQG will help move the discussions also a bit towards that private sector role as well.
Thanks so much, Chiara. And that is the perfect segue for my colleague Tristan to actually come in. So Tristan Knowles is actually an investment specialist based in ADB's private sector operations in Thailand resident mission in Bangkok. It has worked at ADB for 6 years, and during this time has actually led or been part of the deal team for at least 11 private sector climate finance project across wind, solar, geothermal, and electric mobility. So Tristan will talk a little bit about what our private sector operations is doing and what private sector actually needs to do in terms of scaling up climate change solutions and climate change finance in the region. So over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, Esmara. And thanks to Chika and Chiara. Actually, I wanted to compliment CPI and also Esmara. The work that you did on that report focused on APAC climate finance was really timely, because in the private sector operations department of ADB, we've been doing some work on how we can increase our climate finance ambition. And that was as you mentioned, sort of a first of a kind report that gathered all the data on the region and was really useful to do essentially a market assessment of how we're tracking internally with our investments versus where the market is at. So I hope it's something that ADB and CPI can continue to work together on. Look, I guess in the private sector for ADB, we're a smaller part of the institution. ADB has a goal or an ambition to deliver 100 billion cumulatively of climate finance from 2019 to 2030. And of that, 12 billion is expected to come from the private sector operations department. And as a part of our ambition, we're also aiming to mobilize or at least to co-finance and crowd in another 18 to 30 billion. So it's a fairly substantial ambition, but we're also looking at the moment at ways in which we can go beyond this and increase our ambition, noting that the scale of the challenge here is in the trillions, as we're all aware. So I think for private sector, where we've been most active to date, at least in the last sort of 5 years, has been in energy, transport, and agriculture in terms of mitigation, in terms of climate finance. In terms of mitigation, it's mostly been energy and transport. And in terms of adaptation, actually 90% of our adaptation finance has been invested in agriculture, and the other 10% has been in water. So I think what you see in looking at those sectors and in looking at the markets is that, of course, for private sector, the key, because we are expected to get our money back and a return on that money, is the bankability of the underlying investments, the projects, or the companies that we're investing in. And in renewable energy and increasingly in electric mobility, you are seeing, and sustainable transport, there is a bankable revenue model and business model there. And what do we mean by that? I mean, bankable essentially just means that there's enough certainty of the cash flows that the project or the company will generate that you'll be able to repay the debt and the interest on that debt. We have delivered mostly through our debt channels. So we've mostly done debt investments. Probably compared to other MDBs, we're a little bit less active in equity, and we're also very active channel, financial institutions channel. So we definitely think there's some areas where we can increase our investments, both on the sector side. So for example, industrial decarbonization and manufacturing, green buildings and energy efficiency, and also nature-based solutions, and eventually, CO2 drawdown is something that we think we can support. On adaptation, we've been most active, as I said, in agriculture and water. And for adaptation, again, the challenges I think some of the comments have pointed out is that you generally don't have, or it's harder to find a bankable revenue model for adaptation. And without a bankable revenue model, it's very hard to invest. It's something where we'd need to see either more grant support or also more support on the enabling environment side. But one thing to point out in private sector is we do have projects where we don't count them as adaptation finance, but they are adapted. So they're determined to be Paris aligned. So the company in the private sector has already done their assessments. They've designed them to be resilient to climate scenarios. But because it's not an incremental change that ADB has supported, or, I mean, we require it, but it was already built in to the project, let's say, we don't count that as climate finance. So I think there is a bit of a gap there in that you're probably seeing more climate aligned or adaptation aligned investment than necessarily what's counted as climate adaptation finance. I'm not sure if that distinction is clear enough, but it's just a kind of nuance of the way we track things. And I think the other thing to point out on mitigation versus adaptation is that the mitigation opportunity is in the multi-trillions, whereas the adaptation opportunity is in the several hundred billions, depending on the estimate. So I think you're always going to see that the majority of the investment will flow to mitigation, because that's actually the larger need from a funding perspective. But I think at the end of the day, I think Chika and Chiara, their presentations touched on a very important point that I think we always need to keep in mind, and that's project pipeline, the pipeline of bankable investments, because I think there's a lot of focus on structuring and financial innovation and mobilization. And of course, we do that. And that's part of what we do on every project, really, and what we focus on as MDBs in particular. But I think to move things at the scale we need, you need to see that the actual enabling environment is supportive of investment, and that the pipeline of projects is adequate. And to give you an example, I might take Thailand because it's very relevant at the moment. Thailand has about 5 gigawatts of wind and solar installed at the moment. Thailand hadn't really done a major renewable energy program since around 2014 or 2015. In 2022, they announced a program for 5 gigawatts between now and 2030. So basically, this program, a single program, is going to double Thailand's wind and solar capacity. And now what you're seeing, of course, is there is a big pipeline of projects, and there will be capital flowing into that sector in Thailand. So there's a very strong link between the midstream and upstream, and then the downstream investment potential by the private sector. So I think we always need to keep that in mind, as well as the structuring and mobilization conversations. So I might stop there, Esmira. I'm not sure if there's any questions, or if you want to bring Nader in or anything else. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan, and those are very good messages explaining what ADB is also doing and what your thoughts are in terms of scaling up climate finance in the private sector. I do have a few questions, but let me just ask one from the floor. And actually, he's a colleague of ours that we've worked with in the energy sector. But ADB's PSOD is targeting 12 billion out of an ADB target of 100 billion, right? But this is cumulative. For those who are unaware, ADB has a 100 billion target cumulatively from 2019 to 2030. Actually, it's an ambition, right? That we reach that 100 billion by 2030. So basically, PSOD, private sector, is contributing 12% of the total. Is it the potential for ADB's private sector finance a lot higher than this share of the total, given the ability of ADB to leverage mechanisms like bonds, green credit lines, and other blended financing mechanisms?
Sure. I realize also for people joining, it's probably a bit confusing. 100 billion a year mobilization target, and then ADB has the ambition of 100 billion cumulatively by 2030. But yes, I mean, yeah, we think we can do more in the private sector, and that's why we're working on what we're calling the private sector climate finance ambition plan at the moment. There's a report that's available online on ADB's website called the Climate Change Action Plan, and it was just launched last year, and it's all, I guess, a part of our effort to look at how we can achieve our goal of being the climate bank of Asia and the Pacific. So one of the key actions for private sector under that piece of work is to look at how we can actually scale up what we're currently doing. So last year we delivered about $1 billion in climate finance from our own sort of balance sheet, and around $1.5 billion or so in co-financing. To hit our target, we need to get to something like 1.3 billion between now and 2030. But we're looking at scenarios that, could see this increase, much more than that. So yeah, it's something we're working on. We hope to have a bit more to say throughout this year. But I think for the time being, it's an area where, as I said, I think we're looking at it in two ways. One is we can scale up what we already know how to deliver. And the other is we can expand into areas that we haven't been historically as active in. Because I think a big part of this climate challenge is just scaling up what we already have, right? So we know that, I think the IEA put out some work, that we need to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. I think in our developing countries, it's if you worked it out at a country level, it's probably going to be even more than that. So I think we've got a huge challenge to scale up renewables. We've got a huge challenge to scale up electric mobility. They're going to be key technologies for decarbonisation. And then, of course, we've got a whole bunch of other sectors, some of which I already mentioned, that we need to just do more in terms of agri, industrial decarbonisation, green buildings, energy efficiency, more through financial institutions, probably more equity and more funds. I saw there was a comment in the chat about delivering blended finance at a fund level. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunities out there. So I think it's something that we'll hopefully be setting ourselves up to scale up over the next couple of years.
No, and I think blended finance is one of those, mechanisms that it could actually be very useful. But what it really is could be another webinar topic series in the near
That's true.
future.
Yeah,
But
indeed.
yeah, there's a lot of questions in the chat box. We are monitoring them, and we'll get to you at some point for sure. But let me continue on with our next speaker. Naida Krishna Morgado is actually our senior infrastructure specialist and serves as regional climate change focal for ADB, covering climate policy and investment in Southeast Asia. She designs climate finance instruments and helped set up, of course, the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, raising over 500 million in concessional funds for a green recovery platform from the Green Climate Fund, the UK, and the EU. And of course, Naida led the development of ADB's first true climate change policy-based loan for the Philippines and support countries on climate and green finance framework and taxonomy. So Naida, let me ask you to further delve into what ADB is doing, especially in Southeast Asia, the kind of enabling environments, as well as the financing mechanisms that are available, innovative financing mechanisms that are available, and those that you are working on. So over to you, Naida.
Thank you, Asmira, and good afternoon to everyone that's joining. I see there's a huge number of people, so this is always an interesting topic. We love talking about climate finance. We always talk about it at different levels, and I wanted to commend both our presentations because I think we covered the broader landscape of climate finance, and then, as you nicely pointed out, Asmira, the subset of it that is, in the context of the UNFCCC negotiations, which is basically international public climate finance flows. And there are loads of nice questions in the discussion. I wanted to start with some reflections on the two presentations and what they mean for Southeast Asia, and then maybe I can make a quick comment about what ADB is doing. More broadly, I think Tristan already covered very well what we're doing on private sector, but maybe kind of an overarching. Firstly, it really struck me in both the presentations that we were seeing themes across almost all the slides of imbalance, right? There is a massive imbalance between adaptation and mitigation finance. And to me, this continues to be staggering. I know the reasons why, but it continues to be staggering because mitigation is a problem in all countries, but it's really a big problem only in the really carbon intensive countries, right? Where the mitigation investment needs to be that big to transform the economy. Indonesia, Vietnam. But adaptation is a problem in every country, and climate risk is only increasing. And to some extent, it's locked in, right? We know temperatures have increased 1.1 degree already as of today. And, we're definitely going to cross the thresholds from what we see from IPCC report. So it should be in the forefront of everybody's mind and development agenda to be investing in adaptation because there's no getting away from it in our region. So that was one of the imbalance I noted. The other, of course, that we heard again and again, the scale of investment is nowhere near current flows. And then if you delve a little bit more into that, the presentation from OECD on the fact that we still haven't reached the 100 billion, which again is just a teeny, tiny little catalytic piece of the overarching 1.7 trillion. Well, the numbers increase every time we do this assessment. It's staggering to me. So I think imbalance is the name of the game on climate finance in Southeast Asia and maybe more broadly. But in terms of what I think core actions that need to be addressed kind of most immediately and where ADB is also kind of focusing our big push. I mean, we've committed to 100 billion cumulatively across the 10-year period. Within that, in the last couple of years, Southeast Asia has been the home of, let's say, the location of around 30 to 35 to 40 sometimes % of ADB's climate finance. So it's a really important part of our climate operations. And I think knowing the challenges to mobilizing climate finance and the fact that you need an integrated approach to scaling up our climate finance, but also the financing that we mobilize in the region, I think we're kind of looking at it at three levels, right? One is the broader policy and enabling environment for climate action. One is what are the institutions and the planning frameworks that you need to, again, ensure that pipelines are built, and thirdly, at the project, pipeline and project level. And that's what's outlined in our climate change action plan that we launched at COP last year. So in terms of what we're doing in Southeast Asia, at the policy level, NDCs in ASEAN are hugely varied in terms of what the actual targets are and the conditional, unconditional split. But all countries have them, and most countries, other than the Philippines, have a long-term strategy or some kind of a long-term goal they've committed to. So you have the kind of core policy signals there. But what we really need to be doing is maintaining some of that momentum and possibly increasing ambition where it's feasible in the next round of NDCs, that's next year, NDC 2. And so ADB is increasingly, as other development partners are, engaging with governments. Okay, what does that ambition mean? And how can we ensure that it's maintained? Secondly, I think ensuring that that ambition continues to be built into planning and sector frameworks, that's really key. I mean, one of the main issues in almost any country in Southeast Asia is that we have these NDC targets or national adaptation plans, but they're not really reflected in sector plans. And energy sector, I guess to some extent they are, but if you look in other sectors, waste, for example, transport, agriculture, the misalignment between climate policy and sector policy is quite staggering. So that needs to continue to be a piece of work that we all continue to focus on as a group, and certainly it's a big focus of ADB, sector action. I think at the mid-level, institutions and planning systems really working with ministries of finance, ministries of planning to build into their system approaches to integrate climate, to link public financial management and public investment management with the NDCs, with national adaptation plans, with climate priorities is a critical ongoing piece of work. We see ministries of finance are doing loads in this region. There's lots of climate tagging and other approaches being adopted, but not necessarily very consistently and not necessarily triggering the public finance we need. And I think lastly on pipeline, I mean, Tristan mentioned this as well, from a private sector perspective, I'd say it's the same from a public sector perspective. We're not seeing enough action from governments to address what is a highly disaggregated pipeline, especially when you start looking at urban projects like solid waste management or even forestry projects. How do you consolidate and aggregate that so that it's bankable, even from public sector concessional lenders like ourselves and other development partners? I think that's a key point. And the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility that I think was mentioned and has been one of the organizers of this, really focuses on that piece, like building the pipeline, originating new projects, sovereign, so that means the big public sector ones, strengthening the design of those, structuring them better, and then trying to finance them. So I'll stop there, Ismaira. Actually, before I stop, I want to make one point, which is related to Tristan's last point that he made in response to Peter's question. I actually think that ADB's footprint in terms of private sector climate finance is broader just than what we do under our private sector operations. I think we all are working more on that. So what we catalyze and mobilize, not only from our own operations, but also as a result of all the work that we do in the broader policy environment is important. For example, Thailand, we did technical assistance to support the issuance of a green bond during COVID recovery. That was $1 billion bond, close to $1 billion bond. So the technical assistance was only a small share of our money. So in our climate finance, it would count very low. But if we were looking at the broader landscape of everything that we catalyze, and we don't currently measure that, but if we did, I think the number would be bigger and we'd have more room to really scale up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Naida. It's great that you mentioned about, consistency of policies. You have these NDCs, you have these NAPs, but then there are quite the link to the sectoral policies that are being developed within our DMCs, and especially including Southeast Asia. And that remains one of the critical challenges I think that we are facing here in terms of delivering some of our projects, some of our initiatives in the region. Now, there's a few questions here, but before going into those questions, I do have a question for you, Naida, and it is somehow linked with, private sector. There are a number of ADB projects that we are working closely with the private sector department. Both public and private sector are in one team, right? There's a lot of energy projects in general. Can you cite an example that you can think of, at least from Southeast Asia, that has been a successful one that actually integrates both, the private sector contribution as well as the non-sovereign operation, the sovereign operations basically coming together in one project?
I can give you one in Cambodia. Actually, I'm not sure if there is our own non-sovereign operations financing in there. I'm looking at Tristan, he's going to know this better than me, but it's a really nice example, right? I mean, Cambodia has been famous last couple of years for doing these auctions and achieving the lowest prices for solar in the region. At one point, it was lower than everybody else, even lower than India's record-breaking low, right? And that's actually quite a success story for ADB, for other development partners we work with, and for climate investment funds money that went in there. We did a lot of work from the public sector side to develop the enabling framework for those for the projects in solar projects in Cambodia. And in one particular project, the investment in the ancillary infrastructure, so the park itself, for the roads, etc., was funded from the public sector side, and then the park itself was bid out and got these kind of regional loans. We also helped a lot on the transaction advisory around this, already structuring that bidding process and getting in good bidders and good quality contracts. And that's actually quite a successful story in how we didn't use a lot of our own public sector money. It was actually a super small ADB loan from what we usually do, but it was a really integrated approach across all different parts of ADB and actually outside of ADB as well to kind of bring that to fruition. And we're now taking a very similar approach on wind in Cambodia too. So I always like that as an example that we can really have an effect outside of the public sector if we try. But I'm sure Tristan has maybe more recent.
That's my favorite example of what we call a 180B project, actually. So the private sector team did the first ever private sector solar project in Cambodia. It was probably 2017 or something like that, maybe even earlier. It was just a small 10 megawatt Bavette solar project. That kind of showed the government and private sector players that it was possible to do solar at the time. And as Naida said, ADB got involved to do a resource assessment to look at the potential for solar in Cambodia, to look at where you would site a solar park. We then had sovereign investment to fund the basic kind of infrastructure for the park and to acquire the land and do all the pre-clearance and zoning and all that sort of stuff. And then our advisory worked on the auction, and then on the private sector investment side where I work, and I was actually part of that deal team, we were the lead arranger for the deal. So we led the deal. We provided terms to all the bidders ahead of the auction, including blended finance. And then, we made our own investment, and we also mobilized investment from other banks. But it was a small deal, but definitely my favorite example of what ADB can do when we're able to align all the pieces of the puzzle.
Thank you both. That's actually also my favorite example, if I'm asked. But before we go through some of the questions in the chat room, but does anyone want to raise their hands, introduce themselves, and ask a particular question to the panelist? Please do not be shy. We do have like 10 minutes for discussions. It would be good to know some of the attendees, the 300 plus attendees that are listening right now to us. And I know there are a lot of questions that want to be asked, so it would be good for, someone to actually also speak other than the five of us here right now. Anyone brave enough to start it off? No? Oh.
Hello.
Yes.
Good
Yes, please.
afternoon. Yes, I'm Mona La Victoria Vizpres from the Philippines. My question is, well, it's good that we have these discussions, right? But I think unless it's acted on to the level of LGUs, for example, local government, or in cases of the Philippines, the barangays, it would not really impact the common man or person. Like I work in the persons with disability groups, and we always talk about inclusive disaster risk management. Um, so I'm thinking, what are your thoughts about how we can move decision makers in that level maybe partner with you, connect with you, or work with these things? Because I actually have a degree in forestry, and I think we've been talking about this for like more than 30 years. Like I've graduated university 20 years ago, and we're talking about this, but until now it's not getting any better, but getting worse. So yeah, thank you.
No, thanks, Mona. And I think before a panel member respond to that, maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions because I see more brave people raising their hands on in the chat room. Uh, Gaurav Sanhi, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. My name is Gaurav. I represent India. So I am working with a leading think tank in India, also working with a state government where we are helping the state governments to revise their policies where they can work to implement the NDCs in the local level. So I'm trying to understand. So we are working extensively with the across different departments in the state and simultaneously. So I'm just trying to understand that what could be the. So I've also written a question down there in the chat box. So where I just wanted to understand what could be the basic adaptation finance mechanism for developing countries like India, where they are trying to lead the pathways by giving examples and implementing more than the ask at the global forum. So I'm just trying to understand how they can find better financing mechanism. Could be blended, could be private, could be bankable models other than the public ones, and what could be the aspect from a different perspective side, on a global side, for the global south.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Gaurav.
Thanks.
Just one more question before I bring this back to the panel. Raymond Pang, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for all the speakers. You all are really amazing. I have a question regarding carbon tax and CBAM. Right. So yes, across Southeast Asia, there are a couple of countries are planning or revising or studying about carbon taxes and also including or excluding certain industries as a pilot. What do you think about that? With your understanding and expertise, what's the situation like or progress like in terms of carbon tax, if you have any insights into this? And then also, I'm sure a lot of us are aware that the EU is piloting or implementing CBAM really soon, and with ASEAN being a very heavy manufacturing zone and relying on export and also a lot of partnerships with or exports to the EU, how do you see that we can really respond or mitigate the risks or just transition in terms of affecting the economy of ASEAN into EU, of course, and then more countries are also going to implement similarly like CBAM, which will also affect the region. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. I know there's a lot of hands raised, and we'll get back to you. I think we should focus first on this first 3 questions, and the first 2 questions are really focused on access at the barangay or at the local level on how to implement climate change solutions, including a possible, adaptation mechanisms. And maybe Naida, you can start that off. And of course, Raymond is asking about carbon tax, and I think both Tristan or Kiara can also come back to this particular question. So over to you first, Naida.
Thank you very much, Asmira. I think, Mona, your comment is you're spot on. I mean, we are talking at this discussion today about kind of macro level financing flows, mechanisms, and it's harder to see how that filters down at the barangay level or even community level beyond that. I mean, ADB, as a multilateral institution, we have channels of working with different types of partners Our main partner is usually the government, and we have mechanisms to work with the government. Through the government, we can strengthen systems within the country, particularly the downward flow of climate and disaster risk financing. And certainly that's something we try to do in our big disaster risk management projects or climate projects. One of the examples is, it's in the Philippines, the People's Survival Fund is obviously one of these intermediary challenges, mechanisms to really channel finance flows to, particularly to, not to barangays, but to LGUs. And there's been a lot of work done over the years to increase the usability and the finance flows out of the People's Survival Fund. And DOF most recently has seen more on that. ADB has supported a lot with technical assistance over the years. So that's one of the ways that we would try to strengthen those links. I think another is really working at, again, LGU more than barangay level, but with implication obviously going beyond that, in terms of the understanding of climate risk. So we know the 17 vulnerable provinces in the Philippines, the DNR has identified, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has identified as kind of the key areas for adaptation, climate risk, disaster risk management. ADB has put a lot of technical assistance into developing climate risk frameworks, investment plans for those provinces. So that's another example of, I think, how we try to go beyond the macro level as much as we can within the context of the mechanisms with which we finance. Maybe I can add a point on the carbon tax and then hand over. So I think carbon taxes is really critical actually in our region. We need to be looking at how to increase revenues and fiscal resources for climate action and then channel that towards climate action. I think from my understanding of the region, Singapore is the stellar example of a carbon environmental tax that actually works and channels financing towards area of climate need. It's a specific case, but definitely the standout leader. Other countries have been looking at it within the context of broader carbon pricing, but I think Singapore is the only kind of standout example. What I would flag is that environmental taxes have been around for a while, like petroleum taxes and others, which are then sometimes used to fund environmental protection funds. But I think the clear, transparent channel between some of those taxes and funding and environmental proceeds is an area of continuing work in this region. Thanks, Ismail. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Naida. And I'm just checking if Kiara and Tristan would like to add anything on the carbon tax.
Not necessarily on the carbon tax, but perhaps I wanted to, well, also on the carbon tax, but also wanted to add something on the issue of access very, very quickly. So indeed, access, I think we can see it on two ends. One, access to public finance, which is an issue for many developing countries. We know that many climate funds, MDBs, but also bilateral providers have very stringent or very cumbersome requirements for access, and some developing countries find it very challenging. So I think increased capacity building there to help them fulfill all the requirements to access finance is very important. And then on the hand of providers, both bilateral and multilateral providers try to streamline their access is key. There is another issue, which is access in terms of even just knowing that opportunities are there, and we see that especially in terms of private sector investments. When we were working on these two reports that I presented, we did engage with many developing countries and try to understand from their side what is their issue of attracting also private finance. And the real issue is that many local banks do not even know that they would have the opportunity of engaging with like larger providers or MDBs to understand, to find opportunities for investments. And so what in our report on mobilization, especially, we see as a big opportunity that of working more with intermediaries or creating instruments that aggregate opportunities for investments, so that a large investor in, for example, a developed country can just put money in a larger fund, and then is responsible for liaising with smaller business owners or smaller businesses to make sure that they have this financing available. So a little bit more like intermediaries can really help access in terms of reaching smaller businesses and smaller investors in developing countries. On carbon taxes, not much to add actually compared to what Naida has said. I think the issue of carbon taxes is being raised also in the context of the NCQG. So whether the new goal will refer to this potential pool of resources as an opportunity to finance climate action in developing countries is something that is currently under discussion. But definitely could be a potential source that can help just pool more resources for climate action in developing countries.
Yeah, thanks, Kiara. I saw some hands dropping, but maybe I can just turn this over quickly to Pankaj for his question, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can I go back to the email? Yes, can hear you for sure.
This is Pankaj. I'm from India, and basically my question is a very unorganized kind of a question, because I'm talking about a very unorganized sector like agriculture or maybe forestry or land restoration in a country like India. And my question is, how do you, from these sectors, somebody apply for adaptation finance or mitigation finance or restoration finance? Is that even a mandate of this initiative, or do we need regular financial models for the financing, or there is a possibility of a project financing kind of a thing? Because I did see from Tristan knows that he talked about project financing, so I was just interested to know if there is a possibility.
Okay, there's another hand up, Mayun. Maybe we can take your question now, and then and then we can wrap the webinar up. Please, over to you.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mayun from Ministry of Finance, Thailand. I can share a little bit from the perspective on the carbon tax. In the case of Thailand, we use technically in the gasoline we tax on the carbon emission already, but we call it a gasoline tax. And we are on the process of the draft the Climate Change Act submit to the cabinet, as I know so far. In the draft, there has a lot of the article about the carbon tax and carbon credit. I think it may have to make a long way to go to discuss what should happen next. Just inform what happened in Thailand. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And last question from the audience, and before I turn this back to the panel, Ayushi Malhotra, please.
Hi, this is Ayushi. I am from the gender platform CGIR. I have a question regarding the gender responsiveness of climate finance. Agriculture and land use sector are very uniquely positioned for the significant impact. But in terms of the efforts at this nexus, we do not see much. So what are the strategies and opportunities that exist, and what is being done for the gender tagging in climate response that I would want to know more from your side? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So basically, more or less 2 questions here about gender responsiveness of our projects, as well as, the adaptation finance angle. And I think, Naida, you want to start us off as well in terms of, the adaptation possibilities or how we can scale up adaptation finance in general.
Thanks, Asmara. I'll leave the bit about the project financing capabilities to Tristan, but just more broadly in a sector like, as you were saying, Pankaj, agriculture, forestry, highly difficult, very disaggregated, fragmented sectors with lots of smallholders. I've worked extensively on those 2 sectors, at least in some of the Mekong countries. What I will say is that it's a long-term process, which requires quite a lot of assistance over time to pull off an adaptation project, which would be internationally financed, I'd say, with concessional climate finance. Essentially, you do need to have good models at the project level, where at the granular level where you can. But most importantly, you need to have a decent understanding of climate risk as it affects not just the sector, but the particular region or province that you're working in. You need to have solid or, improving intermediaries through whom you can channel your finance. This is me talking at a macro kind of multi-province level, public sector financing. And then you need to be able to demonstrate how that meets and measure how that meets climate risk. And then, of course, you need a lot of support to go out there and actually get some of that financing, whether it's from the Green Climate Fund or one of the bilateral partners. So I would say it's a long-term process, but very much a process that's really needed, and one where I feel the ADB, where we have time and energy to spare, should really be focusing our efforts is mobilizing that kind of financing for our countries. Just on the gender responsiveness of climate finance, I think we're increasingly seeing a correlation between gender tagged climate finance, definitely at ADB. We're also trying to see more and more projects that are kind of core focused on transformational gender, not just mainstreaming gender, even for climate action. I mean, in several countries, we're really supporting on the upstream side, like in the context of NDCs, having a standalone gender action plan, or strategies like we have currently supporting one in Indonesia on climate and gender together. I think that it's an evolving landscape. Part of it is tagging, and then part of it is really ensuring that the outcomes from climate projects are really benefiting women and other groups fairly, and are really exploiting opportunities, particularly for economic opportunities for women and those areas. So I think that one is the tagging aspect, but the other is actually working on the project side. And I hope that ADB will scale it on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Naida. Tristan?
I think Naida hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's the same challenges for private sector with kind of, let's say, small scale, very diverse kind of end users or landholders. So you need an intermediary to operate through, either a financial institution or maybe a larger agribusiness entity. So that's how we would tend to reach that sort of level of scale. Project finance, you typically need, usually it's more for infrastructure, large scale projects where you've got contracted revenues or contracted cash flows. So I think it's more the intermediary channel that Naida mentioned.
Thanks, Tristan. So I note that we're at the hour, 4 p.m. here in Manila. But before we wrap this up, I wanted to thank everyone first for hanging in there, and thank you for all our panel members. But I won't let you go without one final word. So 30 seconds or 31 seconds for each one of you to actually answer this question from me. Is that, climate finance is such a critical topic, obviously from the kind of reception that we've had here. So my question is, how can we actually ensure, and maybe this is more for Chika and Kiara, the transparency as well as the integrity of our climate finance number, because it's quite critical in how we determine the NCQG and how we do our investments, right? So that's one question. But the other question is, we are all focused on climate finance, but at the end of the day, it's an input, right? It's an input to an effective climate outcome. So other than ensuring transparency, integrity of the numbers, how can we also ensure that climate finance comes out with an effective climate outcome? So with that, maybe Chika, you could start it off.
All right, thank you, Asmara. So 30 seconds for me, responding to the first questions on the integrity and also the transparency of the data. Of course, this is really pivotal. That's why in CPI, we try to track in annual basis global climate finance landscape, and then we benchmarking to the global commitment of the climate. So I think the tracking the progress toward the implementation is one of the important aspect that we need to keep up on that. And then on the second one, how to ensure the effective finance for the climate outcome, right? So we just want to make sure that every dollar spent on the climate action is really impactful. For instance, how much is the emission reductions from $1 of the MDB money, for example, or is there any way of this very limited amount of the public finance that can leverage private sector investment? So I think the role of the additionality is also play a role. So because we always talk about concessionality for the past years, right? I think on top of that, we need to really emphasize of the role of additionality of our finance towards the climate outcomes.
Thanks, Chika. Kiara?
Thanks. A few words for me as well. Transparency, very important. I fully agree. I think that the channels for reporting this information are already there, and we have already enough. I mean, of course, the OECD DAC, so Development Assistance Committee, has a database where we collect information on development finance, which is also climate finance in a way. There is the UNFCCC system for reporting. So all the channels are there. I think now it's a bit of an effort on the side of providers to really help them create systems that allow them for really granularly report finance. And we see that especially an issue for adaptation. So it's true that adaptation represents the minority of climate finance, but we also think it's a slight issue of underreporting, because adaptation and development are so interlinked that sometimes it's difficult for providers to clearly understand which projects target adaptation. So again, I think it's just some work that needs to be done, although we have seen a lot of improvements. The OECD works a lot with bilateral providers, especially on reporting, and we have seen some step forwards. Another issue I would mention on transparency, where I think a lot of work can be done, is private sector reporting. There are, first of all, a lot of confidentiality issue. For example, even at OECD, we don't have a publicly available database on mobilization. And that's something that I would ideally need to change, to allow also institutions such as the OECD, but CPI and other stakeholders to take this information and understand what is happening. But being able for us to advise on what to do better, we need to have access to this information in a way. And finally, the point on quality and effectiveness of finance. This is something that, we see a big data gap or transparency gap. Just to give you an idea, a couple of years ago, in one of our climate finance reports, we wanted to include a chapter that looked at the effectiveness of climate finance, so how this climate finance is being used. And we couldn't find the report ended up, the chapter is now 3-page long, because we couldn't find the information to write a chapter on that. There are a few providers that report on how their finance is being used, but they are very few, and the information is very scattered, so it's very difficult to aggregate it in a meaningful way. So again, for sure, a very important point. And here I must say that I think the NCQG will again be an opportunity to give more prominence to the quality issue, and then so that will give incentives for providers and recipients to report on that.
Thank you. Tristan?
Sure. So, I mean, how we're thinking about this from a private sector perspective is that we need scale, scope, and speed if we're going to solve this kind of crisis, right? We need scale because it's multi-trillions and there's a huge multi-trillion gap. We need scope because it's an economy-wide challenge. We need speed because of the urgency and because of the rapidly reducing carbon budget. And so actually, in that sense, and because of those two reasons, I have kind of, and this is my personal view now, I have kind of contrarian views on this. I sometimes think we're too hard on ourselves. And I know we've talked about this, Esmira, and I think we're so far off where we need to be that actually we just need to be doing more across every channel and every sector. And I think sometimes the principles we have in place for counting climate finance or for blended finance principles, they can actually be a hindrance to innovation and testing new models, because it can take so long to work through the principles and to work something out that actually it's a barrier to trying something new. So I know we have to do all this, and I think there's a lot of work that has to be done to track it better. But I also think we need to be a bit less afraid to try new models and try new things, even if it might not fit into the box we've kind of created for ourselves. And for impact, I think the starting point is always a strategic approach. So, we need to look at where the biggest need is, where the best opportunity for pipeline is. It's always going to be about energy, because we know it's an energy challenge. So that's going to be a big part of whatever we do. But we also know now there's an economy-wide decarbonization challenge. So I think start with a strategic approach, track, we need to track better what we do so we can measure those points that Chika touched on in terms of impact per dollar. But I think the starting point is to be strategic. And then again, to my first point, we've just got to do more of everything right now. And some will be more efficient than others, but I think every ton of CO2 counts at the moment. So we have to accept that some tons in some sectors and some instruments will cost more than in others. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. And last but not least, Naida.
So I'm going to contradict Tristan a little bit, but also focus on adaptation and say, I think that to answer both your questions, two things. Upstream support. If you look at adaptation and increasing adaptation finance, I agree with mitigation. We need speed because every ton of carbon you reduce now is, multiple impacts in the future. Adaptation, similar, but the risk of maladaptation is quite high. But if we do decent climate risk assessments and build up our understanding of climate risk, like we have on mitigation, I mean, we have inventories, we know where the emissions are coming from, we know what the issues are in terms of sectors and sources. We don't have the same kind of understanding on adaptation in every country. Yes, agriculture is a problem, but which province, in which way, in which farmers, we don't know. So actually, we need to do the climate risk assessments and the upstream work. And if we do, we'll design better adaptation projects that actually address climate risk and address the beneficiaries that are at risk. So there's your outcome. And number two, it will help us to justify climate additionality of our climate finance, which is critical in the context of negotiation. So I would say on adaptation, we need upstream support. It takes several years, so we need to start now.
Thanks, Aida. And I know I did a very bad moderating here because we're almost 10 minutes beyond our 1.5 hour, but I'd like to thank everyone who has participated. Thank you to the panel members. And we do note that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So some of them we will take into consideration. We'll figure out ways on how to respond to them. But, some of these questions could be future topics of this very successful webinar in the near future. So indeed, landscape is changing, climate finance is critical, but I think we all need to do something to get us to that goal, right? Not just the climate finance goal, but to actually address climate change in our region, in the Asia and the Pacific region. So again, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much. And thank you for sticking out for the 200 plus people who stayed it. Thank you and have a good day, good afternoon, and a good night wherever you may be. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and one more thing for those who are still there, we're going to be sending in a feedback form for this webinar to help us all out. Thanks, everyone.